They know something we don't.
That is so...
It's human nature. We're selfish.
You was right all along. You and me, we was meant to be.
They spent an entire season building these characters up, brick by brick. And in one single episode, they burned it all down. Episode 8 just changed everything. And if you thought Episode 7 hit hard, you have absolutely no idea what's coming. So here we are.
One Mississippi, two Mississippi, three Mississippi.
The season finale of Euphoria Season 3. And after everything that Episode 7 threw at us, Nate's death, Rue's cover being blown, Maddie selling her soul to Alamo, and Cassie screaming over a coffin, you'd think the show would ease up just a little going into the final episode. It didn't. If anything, it pressed its foot harder on the accelerator and didn't let go until the very last second of the very last scene. This was the kind of finale that you sit with long after the credits roll, turning every moment over in your head, trying to make sense of what just happened and what it all meant. It was messy, emotional, brutal in places, and oddly beautiful in others. And honestly, that's Euphoria at its best. Let's start with Rue, because her storyline has been the spine of this entire season, whether the show always made that obvious or not. Going into this episode, she was in arguably the worst position of anyone. Faye had screamed out to wake Wayne up after the safe turned out to be empty, and Rue was left completely exposed inside Laurie's operation with no money, no exit plan, and no one on her side apart from a girl who had just turned on her out of frustration. Wayne had already wanted her dead before that moment. So what happens when the man who wants you gone suddenly has the perfect excuse to make it happen? We found out pretty quickly. The opening of this episode did not waste any time. Wayne came downstairs and the tension in that room was suffocating. Rue had nowhere to go. She couldn't run. She couldn't talk her way out of it the way she'd been doing all season. And for the first time, it genuinely felt like Rue Bennett might not make it out of this show alive. That's not something the show has made you feel this intensely since Season 1, and it was gripping in a way that was almost uncomfortable to watch. But here's the thing about Rue. She has always been at her most dangerous when she has absolutely nothing left to lose. And that's exactly where she was standing in this moment. The DEA connection that Maddie accidentally handed to Alamo like a grenade was now the thing that had the potential to either save her or finish her entirely, depending on which way the dominoes fell. Because Alamo, knowing that Rue was working with the DEA, didn't just put a target on her back inside Laurie's world. It also meant that the DEA operation itself was now compromised, which meant that the people running that operation from the outside had every reason to move fast before everything collapsed in on itself. And that's the cruel irony of Rue's entire arc this season. Every single move she made to try and secure a better future, to get clean, to do something that actually meant something, ended up pulling the threads of her safety net apart one by one. She played Laurie, she played Alamo, she played the DA, and by this point all three of those sides had a reason to come for her. That's not a situation you maneuver out of with charm and quick thinking. That's a situation that ends badly one way or another. What made the Rue scenes in this finale hit so differently compared to the rest of the season was the way that Zendaya played the fear underneath the surface. All season long, Rue has been performing a version of confidence that she clearly didn't fully feel. There was always this brittle quality to it, like she was one bad moment away from completely falling apart. And in this episode, that brittleness finally cracked open. You could see it in the way she moved, the way her eyes were working overtime trying to calculate every possible outcome, the way she kept pulling herself back from the edge of panic because she knew that panic would get her killed. It was genuinely one of the most compelling pieces of performance in the entire run of the show. And it made everything that followed feel earned in a way that a lot of the season's earlier episodes honestly didn't quite manage. Now, while all of that was unfolding inside Laurie's world, Ollie was sitting with the weight of knowing that Rue had ignored every warning he gave her. His opening monologue in Episode 7 about the death book, about the people he lost along the way, about the cost of choices, all of that was paying off here in the finale. Because Ollie wasn't just reflecting on his past anymore. He was watching it repeat itself in real time through Rue. And the question hanging over his part of this episode was whether he was going to be able to do anything about it, or whether he was going to have to add another name to that book that he clearly never wanted to open again. Ollie moving in this episode felt like the show finally cashing in a check it had been writing all season long. Because every conversation he'd had with Rue, every warning, every moment of hard truth delivered with that quiet, steady voice of his, it all pointed to this. He couldn't just sit on the safer side of the road and watch. That's not who Ollie is, and the show knows that. So when he made the decision to reach out to the DEA, contact himself, to essentially force the operation to move before Alamo had the chance to act on what Maddie had told him, it felt completely in character. It wasn't heroic in a loud, dramatic way. It was the kind of heroism that looks a lot like desperation dressed up in calm clothing. He was terrified, but he did it anyway. And that distinction matters because it's what separates Ollie from almost every other adult figure this show has ever put on screen. He doesn't pretend that doing the right thing feels good. He just does it because the alternative is something he can't live with. The DEA moving in on Alamo's operation was the sequence that this entire season had been building toward, and the show delivered it in a way that felt genuinely tense rather than just visually loud. There were no massive shootouts, no over-the-top action set pieces that felt borrowed from a different kind of show. It was tight, it was claustrophobic, and it was uncertain right up until the very last second. Because the question was never really whether Alamo would go down. The question was always who was going to get caught in the crossfire when he did. And the answer to that question is what made this finale genuinely devastating in places. Laurie's entire crew was swept up in it. Wayne, who had been sharpening his knife for Rue all episode, didn't get the chance to use it. And Rue, who had been trapped in that house with no way out, suddenly found herself in the middle of a federal operation that she had technically helped create but had absolutely no control over. Surviving it wasn't a triumph. It was just barely not dying. And the show understood that distinction completely. But let's talk about what happened to Cassie in this episode, because her arc in this finale was the one that landed the heaviest emotional punch of the entire season for me. Going into this episode, Cassie had just watched the body of the person she loved most in the world get pulled out of the ground. She'd screamed herself raw standing over that coffin. And you might expect the show to give her a moment to breathe after something like that. It didn't, because grief and euphoria has never been allowed to exist in a quiet room by itself. It always gets company. And the company that showed up for Cassie in this finale was the full, brutal weight of every decision she'd made since the beginning of the season crashing down on her all at once. The followers were gone again. The TV role was gone. Nate was gone. And Maddie, the person she had genuinely believed was still her best friend underneath all of the chaos, and the using and the transactional ugliness of their relationship, made it crystal clear in this episode that she was not. The scene between Cassie and Maddie in this finale was one of the most painfully honest exchanges the show has ever written between these two characters. Because Maddie didn't scream at her. She didn't do anything dramatic. She was just cold. Completely and utterly cold in a way that was far more devastating than any argument could have been. She looked at Cassie the way you look at something that used to be useful and isn't anymore. And Cassie felt every single degree of that coldness. You could see it register on her face like a slow realization rather than a sudden shock, which made it even harder to watch. Because somewhere deep down, Cassie had known this was coming. She just hadn't been ready to admit it to herself. What the show did really cleverly with Cassie's storyline across this entire season is that it used the fame and the followers and the social media success as a mirror. On the surface, it looked like a story about ambition and the price of chasing it. But underneath that, it was really a story about a girl who has never once in her life felt like she was enough on her own without someone else validating her existence. First it was the attention she got from boys. Then it was Nate. Then it was the followers. And every single time she reached for something to fill that gap, it either slipped through her fingers or turned around and hurt her. By the time we get to this finale, Cassie has lost every single version of the thing she thought would make her feel whole. And what she's left with is just herself. No filters, no followers, no Nate, no Maddie. Just Cassie. And the look on her face in the final scenes she shares with the camera told you everything you needed to know about whether she was ready for that or not. She wasn't. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only way she was ever going to figure out who she actually is underneath all of it. Maddie's trajectory in this finale ran in almost the exact opposite emotional direction to Cassie's, and that contrast was clearly intentional. Where Cassie was being stripped back and left raw and exposed, Maddie was hardening, calcifying, becoming something that, if you'd shown it to her at the beginning of the season, she would never have recognized as herself, because that's the thing about Maddie's story that makes it so unsettling to watch. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It was gradual, one compromise at a time, one decision that felt justified in the moment because the situation demanded it. Using Dylan without his knowledge, going to Alamo for the money, telling Alamo about the DEA as a throwaway comment that she probably told herself didn't really matter. Each individual step felt small enough to survive. But when you stack them all on top of each other and look at where Maddie is standing by the time this finale closes out, she's somewhere completely unrecognizable from where she started. And the show doesn't let her off the hook for that. It doesn't frame it as tragic circumstance that happened to her. It frames it as a series of choices that she made, one after another, with full awareness of what she was doing. That's a harder and more honest thing to put on screen than simple victimhood, and it's one of the things this season got genuinely right about Maddie's character. The debt to Alamo, hanging over her head going into this finale, was never really about money. That's what makes it so suffocating. Alamo isn't a loan shark who just wants his percentage back and then leaves you alone. He's someone who collects people, who finds leverage, and holds on to it indefinitely because power over someone is always worth more to him than whatever the original transaction was. Maddie walked into that arrangement thinking she understood the terms. She didn't, and by the end of this episode, she understood that completely. The scene where Alamo reminded her of exactly what she now owed him, not just financially but in terms of loyalty and access and silence, was one of the quieter scenes in the episode but one of the most chilling. Because he wasn't threatening her. He was just explaining reality to her in the same calm, reasonable tone he uses for everything. And that reasonableness is what makes him so genuinely frightening as a character. He doesn't need to raise his voice. The situation does all the work for him. Now let's get to the ending itself. Because the final sequence of this episode was the kind of closing chapter that rewards everyone who stuck with this season, even through the moments where it lost its footing. With the DEA operation having moved in and Alamo's world beginning to collapse around its edges, the show pulled back and gave us something quieter and far more emotionally complex than a simple takedown. Rue made it out, but made it out as doing a lot of heavy lifting as a phrase there, because the version of Rue that walked away from all of this was not the same person who started the season. She was thinner, hollowed out in places, carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from having lived through something that cost her more than she had available to spend. She went back to Ollie, and that scene, just the two of them sitting together in that familiar space, said more without words than most of this season managed with entire monologues. Ollie didn't say "I told you so." He didn't lecture her. He just looked at her the way someone looks at a person they genuinely feared they were never going to see again. And Rue, for the first time all season, didn't perform anything. She just sat there and let herself be seen. It was a small moment, but it was the most human moment the show gave us all season. The final shot of Rue looking out from that window, quiet and still, was the show drawing a deliberate line between who she was and who she might still become. Whether she actually gets there is a question the show left completely open. And honestly, that ambiguity felt right. Because Rue's story has never been about a clean resolution. It's always been about the space between relapsing and recovering, between destroying yourself and choosing differently, between the person you are at your worst and the person you're capable of being when you're finally honest with yourself. Leaving her in that in-between space, rather than wrapping it up neatly, was the most truthful thing the finale could have done with her. Cassie's final scene was the one that genuinely surprised me. After everything that had been taken from her, after the grief and the humiliation and the cold cruelty of Maddie's exit from her life, she sat down and started writing. Not posting, not performing for an audience, just writing. For herself. And it was such a quiet, unexpected pivot for a character who has spent the entire season screaming for attention in one form or another that it actually stopped me in my tracks. It felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of something, which is either the show setting up a potential fourth season storyline or simply the writers giving Cassie something she's never really had before. a sense of direction that belongs entirely to her and nobody else. Overall, this finale did what a good season finale is supposed to do. It paid off the tension that had been building, it gave the characters moments that felt earned rather than convenient, and it left you with enough questions to keep turning it over in your head long after it ended. Was every part of this season perfect? Absolutely not. There were episodes in the middle stretch where the pacing dragged and certain characters, Jules being the clearest example, were so underserved that they barely registered. But the back half of this season found its footing in a way that genuinely redeemed a lot of the earlier stumbles. And this finale was the best possible version of how it could have ended. Euphoria Season 3 went out swinging. And for a show that had everything to prove coming back after such a long gap, that counts for a lot.